Greetings and welcome to this special episode of the Pandemic Podcast here live in London from outside Westminster, where thousands have gathered in the streets to protest against the police bill. There's speeches on nearby, but on this very day where thousands have gathered here to protest outside the House of Lords against the undemocratic police bill that threatens the right for the public to protest, the government have taken to the stand to once again violate our civil liberties. So if you haven't seen the news, Plan B has been announced this evening. This, of course, was announced back in September, and at the time, of course, they said that it'll never happen, but here we are, of course, deny, deliberate, deploy. Interestingly enough, the large part of the question and answer session at the end of the broadcast, the press conference was taken up with questions about the government's ministers and how they violated the lockdown rules last year. A large portion of the questioning was asking about the investigation into the MPs and the various different ministers who violated last year's regulations, lifting the lid on trust, I would say. But I would like to give you a kind of a rundown of the press conference. I interrupted my involvement in the protest here, the footage of the protest rather, to watch the broadcast in full, and now I'm here to give you an update before recapping what's going on here in London. So ultimately the broadcast was opened up by saying that cases are on the rise, and that we need to introduce Plan B in order to slow the spread of Omicron, and drive our booster program, in order to reduce the spread. I'll move away from the march a little bit so you can hear what I'm saying. Which means that now from Monday, the government has issued work from home guidance very clearly. Work from home guidance, so businesses are being asked to send their workers home to work from home. And then from Friday, mask mandates have been extended to indoor venues, theatre, cinemas, etc. And worst of all, vaccine passports, or as they called them, NHS COVID passes, aka vaccine passports, are now being deployed in England, which will be used in nightclubs, in any unseated venue where there's over 500 people, in any unseated venues where there's 4,000 plus people, and in any venue 10,000 plus. The only positive is where it's the lesser of two evils, but the only positive is where previously the government had stated that you would not be able to enter any venue purely on your vaccination status. They've included a negative lateral flow test, so it's not as extreme as purely vaccinated based. But nonetheless, it's absolutely draconian, and I'll talk about the baseless logic of the policy in a moment. But they've given 1 week's notice for these affected venues to get their house in order effectively and look at how they enforce these policies. And in addition to these pieces, rather than asking people, the contacts for the contact trace system to self-isolate, they've asked people to take daily tests, which of course is only going to drive up the case numbers further. And the ultimate, as we expected, driving message is get your jabs, which again I'll talk about in a moment, because so far the evidence suggests that the current jabs are even less effective against this particular variant, but I'll come to that in a minute. Boris and Whitty talked about four key data points. One, vaccine efficacy. Two, severity of the variant, the speed of spread of the variant, and the NHS. And again, I'll comment on those in a moment. They spoke about how cases are doubling every 2 to 3 days of the new variant. But of course, we've only got a very limited data set at this moment in time, and I'll talk more about the South African data in a minute, which is clearly been manipulated to skew the perception of Omicron, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. But interestingly, then Chris Whitty brings up the data charts and says hospitalizations are declining, deaths are declining. So we've seen, obviously, we know that these are lag measures behind cases, but of course, now that we've got a new scariant, the testing regimen will increase dramatically. But as a result of this, this announcement has been made off the back of decreasing hospitalizations and decreasing mortality. But Whitty goes on to describe this as a significant issue. I don't know how you can describe it as a significant issue when the overall health markers are declining in a positive direction. Now, that said, it has been seen that Omicron as a variant is growing in different territories around the world. But at this stage, it's very early stage. So all of this has been done based on guesswork on this particular variant. And of course, many of the scientists around the world are standing up saying, well, this is much milder. We don't really know anything about this yet. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. Yet, of course, as predicted, the British government have used this to deploy further restrictions on our civil liberties and human rights. Now, let's talk about the variant and the cases. So it's been revealed that in South Africa, there was 17,000 cases that were basically dropped into the numbers to coincide with the announcement about the Omicron variant. So, of course, what that looked like on the charts is this huge surge in cases in South Africa. But many of these cases were dated back as far as April 2020. So these are not new cases, but they've been utilised in order to create fear amongst the population once again to drive this policy. And when you actually look at the current case data, it's much, much, much smaller. So again, data is being used to manipulate the public. Surprise, surprise. Now, the other piece here, the other interesting piece around this is that the actual measure to track the Omicron variant at this moment in time is what they call the S gene failure marker. Well, the S gene failure marker basically means within the PCR test it's not detecting the S gene marker. But that can also be an indication of a false positive. There's been a fairly significant amount of papers written on if there's an insignificant number of markers that have been detected, it can't necessarily be deemed a true positive. But of course, the reason why the S gene failure is a marker is because of the mutations in the gene that's been spoken about. But it's in my view, it's not a consistent way to measure this. But again, even if it is a consistent measure, it's done on a very small sample. So essentially, we don't really know anything about the potential caseload. We don't really know about the severity, but the government has made decisions anyway based on limited information, despite the fact that scientists and many of the experts around the world are saying, well, hang on a minute, we don't actually know how fast it's growing, and we actually don't know how severe it is, but the early indication is it's less severe. So Plan B has been enacted upon this, as mentioned, work from home orders, further mask mandates, and now vaccine passports in England. Interesting. Small squad of police just surrounding me there for a minute. So the government talked about they're expecting cases to rise, but again, this expectation has been made based upon a very small sample data, and of course, all of this is based upon a whole series of unknowns. So the government keeps banging on about following the data. Well, it isn't full stop following the data. So the other piece here about this message, of course, is to drive home the booster campaign. Now, what has been made evident across this issue is that many of the cases that have been detected so far have been detected again within the fully vaccinated. The very first cases that were detected were also detected within the fully vaccinated, within countries that actually have vaccine passports, so it shows how effective they are. But what is evident here is that the and Chris Whitty actually stated this in the, I'm just looking at my notes here, that we know that clinically, this is from Chris Whitty, we know that clinically it can evade vaccines, this variant, right? So if you know that clinically it can evade vaccines, why would you invest all of that money and resources into massively ramping up a booster campaign where you do not know that it's actually going to be effective? Even the World Health Organization came out with a statement earlier this week saying that they're not clear that this could be effective against this particular variant. So we're taking all of the potential risks of the vaccine, which if you haven't been following the stories around those risks, then you really must pay attention. And even if those risks are to be censorship-free, relatively low in the context of the millions of doses, they are, when you start to look at the absolute numbers, the actual numbers, the adverse reactions are extremely high. And also when you start to see all-cause mortality rising in the countries that have got the highest vaccination levels, you still really do have to ask questions. So if the government has said on live television that they know that clinically this variant can evade the vaccines, then how is it that's now used as a justification to roll out even more boosters? It doesn't seem to make sense. Now, the other interesting point here is that over the last 12 months, many of the scientists and academics that are not funded by Big Pharma have been warning of this occasion, been warning that the mass vaccination program at this stage of the pandemic is likely to lead to selection pressure on the virus, which is likely to lead to vaccine evasion and these types of mutations. Those scientists and academics are not funded by the pharmaceutical industry, so they of course don't have. There's no incentive for them to be untruthful. Yet those, interestingly, that have been funded by Big Pharma or connected to Big Pharma or connected to vaccine manufacturers have been denying that potentially of reality. But I think it's about time we start to ask those questions, and start to be responsible in tracking whether these mutations are as a result of mass vaccination or could be as a result of mass vaccination. Now, what's interesting about the overall the messaging here, I'm just going to take a look at my notes, that there was a question asked by the media about whether the UK would follow a mandatory vaccination path that's been seen in other countries. Now, Boris repeated the fact that he said at the early stages of the pandemic that they wouldn't follow that. It's not the way how we do it in Britain. But then he went on to say that we would need to have a national conversation about how we move forward if we want to get rid of non-pharmaceutical interventions, i.e. lockdowns, etc. And he hinted at the fact that there would be further vaccine mandates, and hinted at the fact that there could be further restrictions on the unvaccinated, basically hinting that there will be some more coercive and forceful measures on those who don't comply. But he was very unspecific, but you can watch the actual broadcast to see what I mean in that sense. Now, what was really interesting during the Q&A, as I mentioned at the beginning, multiple questions were asked of the government ministers that were found to be having parties and flouting the rules themselves last year. There's going to be an investigation into that. Most of the questions were directed at Boris were about this violation of the policies, which in many ways lifts the lid on the trust of the government. I mean, the media are laughable. I mean, there's been so many lies and misrepresentation of information. There's been so many fallacies throughout the course of the pandemic, which they just stay completely away from. They completely ignore all of the vaccine harms. They completely ignore that there's people collapsing on sports grounds once every 4 days in Europe, and choose to say, "Oh, Boris, you've been violating the rules. There's one rule for you and one for us," and that's the thing. Whilst it is true and it's abhorrent that they do that, there are much bigger issues, to be quite frank. There's much bigger issues that they could be asking questions of, but nonetheless, if that's their route into asking questions, so be it. So they spent a lot of time asking about how these ministers flouted the rules and said they even went as far as saying it would be hard to mandate these rules to the public when the government don't even follow it themselves. Absolutely. I think the public are less likely, much less likely to comply, because of course non-compliance is one of the only ways out of this, ultimately. Now, just a final few points. There were lots of questions about what's the potential reality. Is this life now? The reference was made to the previous point that Boris made, that this was going to be irreversible. We're going to be out of this, and if everyone just gets their jabs, then no more lockdowns, no more restrictions. We just move on forward. And of course, that's materialised not to be the case. So, in answer to my question at the beginning of the podcast, can we trust the government? I think that's a firm no. And interestingly, as you can hear all the drums behind me, I'm in London today for the police bill. There's a lot of people here that don't trust the government. And I think this is an opportunity to really lift the lid of trust and start to really delve into, at scale, the issues that have materialised as a result of the pandemic response. But in terms of the conversation within the broadcast tonight, they talked about, is this going to be life as normal now? Is it just on-off restrictions for over a period of time into the future because of these new variants? Again, going back to the previous point, what's causing the variants? Again, if you hadn't noticed, each of the main variants that we've come across so far all originated in countries where the vaccine trials were conducted. United Kingdom, Brazil, South Africa, India, and now they've emerged again within the vaccinated population. We just shouldn't be afraid of asking these questions, but if you think about it from a psychological point of view, the government is basically, and the world has basically taken a single strategy to try and end this, which anything that then contravenes that strategy leaves them empty-handed. So there's no incentive for any government or institution to back down on their original plan, which is exactly what's going to happen now. You're going to watch the intensity of the booster campaign, even though it's not clear whether it offers any reasonable protection against the new variant. And that's putting the safety issues aside. And then the government go on to talk about how we may need other vaccines and more vaccines, this and that, and a long-term vaccine strategy. We may need to tweak the vaccine and bring out the whole selection of more vaccines. It's just like, well, it's become a vaccine sellers club. I mean, it just becomes deplorable. I mean, there's so many people who have thought, I've had my double jabs, and that's what they think to themselves, and it's all over now for me. And it's like, no, now I need a third. Now I'm told I may need a fourth, as in Israel. And even that might not be enough, because all these new variants, which may be emerging because of the vaccination program itself. So we stand at a very awkward time. And as expected, going into winter, we have these new restrictions. But I think what it's going to do is it's going to drive a further wave of non-compliance. It's going to drive further frustrations amongst wider portions of the population. And the government seems like they're getting desperate. There's very little evidence for what they're doing here. It's too early in the process. And they're just playing a political game. They're playing the political card. It was even captured this week where there was a tweet that said, captured some text from a document that says that the government is going to win votes on the COVID card here this winter because they're seen to go hard and fast, even though there's no material data. And I think they're misreading the situation because people want to get on with their lives now. So in summary, Plan B is going to be enforced. That's going to mean work from home orders or guidance, vaccine passports, COVID certification with lateral flow tests, and increased mask usage. So as the government said, they planned for this in September. Well, you actually did say that you were planning to avoid it, but here we are. So there's lots of issues here, but the good news is the press is starting to ask some questions, even if it's down to the conduct of the MPs. If that's what it takes to start opening to lift the lid of trust, then so be it. And then, as you hear behind me tonight, I'm in London, outside Westminster, right now, where the demonstration is taking place against the police bill, which threatens to remove the right to protest. Now, we live in a time in history where the right to protest has never been more important than it is now. when you've got so many governments and central institutions around the world that have essentially been flat out lying to their populations over the past 2 years, misrepresenting information and acting in bad faith. So we need the right to protest, and what better way to protest the right to protest by protesting. So here today at the House of Lords, the government's, the House of Lords, the Lords have been gathering to debate the amendments that have been tabled on the police bill. And there's people here out in force tonight from all different backgrounds. There's people from all different causes, from the left and the right of politics, the ups and the downs, from every different spectrum, uniting today here on the issue of the police bill. So with everything that's happening in the world right now, we need to protect the right to protest. And we also need to challenge the government on its decisions. For too long now, the government has got away with making decisions based on flawed or missing data or misrepresented data. It's time that we start to hold people to account and we start to make the MPs responsible